Well, hello, Bob Costanza. How are you?
I'm well. How are you, David Sloan Wilson?
I am so excited about this podcast that we're going to be doing, which is going to be centered on a school of thought that you helped to found, ecological economics, through the lens of a new paradigm, as we're trying to market it. And so there's a lot to talk about. Let's just launch in. Let me introduce you to our very diverse audience. You are Professor of Ecological Economics at the Institute for Global Prosperity at the University College of London. You have a long list of other affiliations, including Senior Fellow at the Stockholm Resilience Center in Stockholm. You are co-founder and past president of the International Society for Ecological Economics and
Mhm.
editor-in-chief of its journal. Many books, most recently Addicted to Growth, published in 2023, which I just had the pleasure of reading. Would you like to add to that by way of introducing yourself?
Well, it might be interesting to just give my educational background. I have
Yeah.
a master's degree in architecture and a
Hmm.
PhD in systems ecology.
Working with
And
the
PhD,
legendary Eugene Odom.
yeah, he was my thesis advisor. And so I've been into systems thinking, I think, since at least then, and trying to put together, all of the pieces rather than simply look in more depth at some of them. And so I think that's what led, pretty much directly to the idea of ecological economics. You have to look at the whole system. And it was always hard coming up with a term that encapsulates everything that we were trying to do with that. But I think the systems part, I think, is a really important component of it. So it could have been called systems economics, but we wanted to really emphasize the need to integrate, ecological thinking and economic thinking at that point. So
Well,
yeah, let's.
there is a complex systems economics. So basically, some of this derives from ecological systems, ecosystems.
Yeah,
Some of it derives from, the so-called sciences of complexity, like that's represented by the Santa Fe Institute. Um, so these are all systems oriented, but are there differences between them, or do you just see this very generally as a complex systems approach?
I think it is a complex systems approach, but an applied complex systems approach to
Right.
the real world, not just to theoretical, mathematical models, but and also with a goal in mind. So how do we make that complex system better over time? So it does definitely have a management kind of component to it, not just understanding that system, but how do we use that understanding to improve the system going forward. And we settled on ecological economics partly because they both have the same Greek root, oikos, which means
Yeah.
the house. And so one is the study of the house, one is the management of the house. You got to do those things, together. I, we thought.
Yeah.
I
And I
still
should
think.
say that I have one of my most valued colleagues is John Gowdy, who was
Mhm.
also president of the of that society, I believe.
Yeah. Yes.
And he was my mentor, and we published several articles together. So hats off to John. In
Yeah.
addition to and to yourself. Well, I'm interested in the structure of the economics profession and why it seems to be divided into something that's called orthodox and something and then other schools of thought, which are sometimes called heterodox, even renegade. So these there's a population structure, to use actually an ecological term, to the profession, and there's a sense in which some of these smaller schools of thought fail to penetrate. They're they contain great value. I mean, who can argue that economic systems are complex, that they're embedded in social, political, and environmental? Who can argue with that? That's just
Mm,
common sense. And yet,
you would
and
think.
so in the first place, why does so-called orthodox economics, by which I think we mean neoclassical economics fail to incorporate
Yeah.
these these things. So maybe you could just speak on the relationship between ecological economics and orthodox economics and the whole dynamics, which is makes them hard to to mix, it appears.
Right. Well, I think it comes down to the problem of orthodoxy in general, and how paradigms or particular models of the world become dominant, and then become locked in essentially. So I think part of it is an investment trap, a sunk cost kind of phenomena, where the whole profession of economics has invested so much, in the model, in the way of thinking of things, and sort of mathematical artifice attached to it. And that's where they derive, their power, essentially, influence on what happens. And so breaking out of those kinds of lock-ins or addictions, I think, is another kind of societal addiction, is very difficult. And and it's like Kuhn's idea of changing paradigms as well. There has to be, a crisis or enough counter information, or enough time to overcome that. And you might think of it, if you think of it as an addiction, then what's the therapy? And I think part of that therapy is coming up with a better alternative that makes more sense. But there's still, just doing that, I think, is not, it's not quite enough to overcome that investment that's still there.
Yeah, well,
I
let's
think it's happening slowly. I think it is happening. But certainly we started ecological economics in 1989, and so it hasn't happened quite yet. And I think maybe part of it might be just coming up with the right terminology that links in, or that motivates people. So maybe your new stab at it might do the trick. But yeah, I think that's part of what's behind it. It's just there's too much investment there to walk away from. Even though what we're saying makes total sense, I think there shouldn't be a problem, incorporating that into economic thinking.
well,
But
there's
yeah,
one angle to this that I want to showcase because it's I mean it's the focus of your book, and it brings in an entirely different set of disciplines, like the disciplines of therapy.
yeah,
So
yeah,
what you're saying is that society is addicted in a way that we really need to take seriously, in the same way that individuals become addicted. And if that's true, then we could use techniques that are effective for individual level addiction, and we can apply those methods to society level addiction, is basically what you're saying in your book. And
right,
somewhere along the lines in your career, you came across my colleague and co-founder of Pro-Social World, Paul Atkins.
yeah.
And so I'd like to know, I mean, hardly anybody brings in psychotherapy. I mean, that's not ecology, that's not complex systems, that's a whole other set of disciplines.
Right,
And
but
but
that is that was the idea behind ecological economics, is that it should be really transdisciplinary. That to understand this world, we've got to take advantage of all the knowledge that's out there, and try to put the pieces together, rather than staying in our little academic silos,
right.
like the conventional economic silo. So if you never hear anything outside that bubble, then it's hard to make any influence on it. But I think there has been some influence of psychology on economic thinking. The whole sort of behavioral and experimental economics that's had some influence, but I don't think anybody's really explored this whole idea of addiction and therapy applied to social
Well, tell me
systems.
how you encountered it, and I'm especially eager to know your collaboration with my friend and colleague Paul Atkins.
I think the main collaboration there was with Tim Kasser,
Hmm.
who's a psychologist out of Knox College, I think, and he wrote a book called The High Price of Materialism, that's how I first encountered him, showing that people who are more materially oriented, in their goal structure and values, actually have higher levels of both mental and physical illness. So they're not happy happier. by pursuing, so narrow-mindedly the material vein. And that's sort of what we're doing at the societal scale. And he was kind of making that extension. And I forget where I first ran into him in person, but we started talking about that whole idea of addiction and is is and societal addiction, and eventually collaborated on this the one paper that we did with Paul, and and I ran into Paul at ANU, at Australian National University. He had the office across the hall from me by chance.
Right.
And we got to talking about some of these things, and actually did a sort of workshop course together to pursue some of these ideas that eventually ended up in the one paper and then expanded into the book.
You've
So
also had numerous collaborations with Eleanor Ostrom, who's another
yeah.
pillar of our techniques. Maybe you could talk about your uh, relationship with Lynn Ostrom.
Yeah, no, she was great. I first ran into her in Stockholm at the Bayer Institute. This was before the Stockholm Resilience Center, Bayer Institute for Ecological Economics. And she was part of a workshop that I was involved with there. I got to know her, and we ended up writing a book together with a couple of other colleagues. Yeah. And then, her ideas about managing the commons, I think, have been extremely influential on you, me, and hopefully a whole range of other people. And the idea that, we have to have a much more nuanced type view of property rights and property rights regimes and how they influence behavior, but also how to put these institutions together in a more collaborative way that actually is sustainable and that leads to higher well-being overall. That where the people involved are happier. So that certainly is what we're trying to achieve. And so we've been working more recently on this idea of common asset trust, even applied, to the major remaining open access commons, the atmosphere and the oceans. And we wrote a short piece together, Eleanor Ostrom, Peter Barnes, who also came up with this a similar kind of idea, and a few other people, that we should think of the atmosphere as a common asset that we all own together. Once you've established property rights, then you can start charging those who damage the property. Even though it's common property, it's still property. And so we should start charging the 90 entities who are responsible for 2/3 of the carbon emissions on the planet, the fossil fuel companies, essentially, for the damages they've already caused and for the potential future damages. Put those funds into a trust that could then be used to mitigate the damages, to replant forests and wetlands, to basically make the planet whole again, as it were, in a legal sense. And there's the whole there's also a legal framework that applies well to that, something called the public trust doctrine, if you've ever run across that. And this is a collaboration with a lawyer out of University of Oregon, Mary Wood, who wrote a book called Nature's Trust. That the public trust doctrine says that sovereign governments have the responsibility to protect the community assets, and it's been applied to some extent, to open water, to shorelines, to some of those open access, but it should be applied much more broadly. And certainly the atmosphere is our biggest community asset. The only problem being it's all of the sovereign governments who have influence on and are affected by the atmosphere. So the idea
Well,
we're
there's also
pursuing, yeah,
space. I mean, there's the space
and
commons.
space,
People talk about the space commons.
exactly, yeah. So
So the atmosphere and beyond.
and beyond, and to other habitable planets, maybe. I don't know,
Yeah.
but anyway, those sorts of ideas, and I think that's where Ostrom's influences really come in. Can we design institutions, in a modern sense that work the way some of the institutions that she studied, in indigenous cultures, for how to manage, watersheds and other things. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So I mean, so I think that that's what we've built out of the Ostrom's work is the two things: the core design principles and polycentric governance. I think
Hmm.
the so one point to make which actually does need to be made. It's not obvious to everyone. Structure is needed. Structure is needed.
Yeah.
You can't
Yeah.
just get everyone to be, whole compassionately oriented and expect them to act compassionately. Structure is definitely needed, and and that there's first of all there's a strong theory of what that structure must look like, and that's what her core design principles represent to me.
Right. Right. Right.
With auxiliary design principles, a distinction between the functional principle and its implementation. It's complicated. It's not a cookie cutter solution, but to a remarkable degree, the core design principles do represent the a governance which is context free. In other words, all contexts, all scales, which is amazing, an
Mm,
amazing simplification.
yeah.
And another thing that you point out in your book is that this structure does exist at a variety of scales. And so basically we have positive examples to learn from. It's not
Right.
just theoretical. In fact, there's plenty of positive examples that have evolved at middle level, meso level scales that we
Right.
can expand upon if only we know what to look for. So is that could you give like, a really good positive example at a meso scale? I guess Costa Rica is known for some.
Costa Rica is a good example, yeah, of something. Certainly the whole idea of eco villages, and transition towns at smaller scales. I used to live in a co-housing community in Vermont, which was at the scale of 17 households, but I think that embodied a lot of those core design principles that we're talking about. Costa Rica as a country, I think is at least part way there. I mean, they got rid of the military and put all of that funding they would have spent on the military into education and healthcare. And so their levels of education and healthcare relative to other Central American countries are much, much better. Historically, I like the example of Bali and the Subak system. I don't know if
Steve
you know that
Lansing's
one.
work. Steve
Yeah,
Lansing's work. Yeah.
Steve Lansing's work, and so and that the really interesting systems dynamics modeling work that they did of that system, just to
Yep.
show how well it actually did function.
Yep.
Even from a modern system dynamics perspective,
Hmm. Yep.
they had gotten all of these principles down, and they had through time, trial and error, I guess, and had worked it all out and formalized it in their sort of religious system. But it but it worked really well. So the World Bank came in and said, hey, you should use fertilizers and try
Yeah.
to get more yield.
Yeah.
And that
That's a great.
totally screwed up the whole system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great story. I want to push back a little bit on something like the transition time movement without disparaging it at all. I think my understanding of that particular movement was it started off, a great start. I mean, my heavens, something I think it's what only 20 or so years old that it originated. And all of these are examples of cultural evolution, I want to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
everything that takes place, of course, is an example of cultural evolution. It has a historical origin, and then stuff happens. And it spreads to a degree or does not spread. And basically, what it achieves is a distribution and abundance. And here's where I think our training as ecologists comes in handy. That when we think of cultural diversity as biological diversity, then any cultural form has a distribution and abundance. It exists here, but not there.
Yeah.
And was a historical process. So to view the cultural diversity as like biological diversity, I think is one of the um, uh, insights, I think, elementary insights that
Hmm.
comes from an ecological approach. So you look at the transition town movement, and it's spread. What did you say? There's over 1,000
Yeah.
international.
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing. But if you were to look at them, and another point I want to make is that when Lynn Ostrom studied common pool resource groups, which what she showed was not that they all employ the core design principles, but they vary in their implementation of the core design principles. And it was only the high performers that implemented the core design principles. That's why she was able to derive them in the first place.
Yeah.
And so what I find with movements of all kinds. You could say the transition time movement, the Charter for Compassion, any movement like this, which results in groups that are trying to do something pro-social, they vary, just like the groups that Eleanor Ostrom studied. You get the high end of the distribution, high performing towns, but then there's the rest of them.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch that exist in name only.
Yeah.
And for many of them, it's a beleaguered group of volunteers
Hmm.
that's far, far below their potential friends. I hate to say it, but I
Hmm.
think that's the reality.
Hmm.
And so that's what we need to work with and improve again and again and
And
again. Don't you think so? Don't you
I
agree?
no, I agree. I agree, and I think the question is, well, how do we take the high performers and how do we increase the selection pressure, I guess,
Yeah,
for those kinds of solutions,
yeah,
because they're there. The mutations are out there. We have the examples, but they're not replicating as fast as they should. And I think part of that problem is the dominant paradigm that we're sort of locked into, which puts a lot of pressure on not doing anything different than we're doing. And so those systems have to work within the next larger system, and it's hard to make any progress there. And so this gets back to, well, fundamentally, what do we have to change in order to make this progress, to get that evolution in the direction that I think we're proposing to go faster. And I think that goes back to the analogy with therapy at the individual level.
yeah.
And what we came up with at Tim's suggestion was that, well, there's one therapy that seems to work really well at the individual scale, something called motivational interviewing, which I had certainly never heard of before, but started looking into it. And what that does is it does not confront the addict with their problem. It doesn't necessarily, go into little discussion groups, but instead starts by, engaging them in a discussion of their life goals. So take them out of the present into the future. What do you want to achieve with your life? How do you actually establish clearly what those goals are? And then that is necessary really to motivate the changes in the present, to achieve those goals. And pretty obvious when you start thinking about it, I mean, at any scale and in any system, if you don't have clear goals, your
Yeah.
chances of achieving those goals are not
Well, that, I mean,
gonna
by the
work.
way, that's how we interpret the first core design principle of Eleanor Ostrom. The group has to have a strong sense of identity and purpose.
Yeah, yeah,
And so that kind of goal setting is what we're about. And so absolutely. So we're 100% in agreement that kind of goal setting is needed. And there's lots of positive examples. Appreciative inquiry. There's a bunch. Participatory
right.
modeling. And there's another point to be made there of basically convergent cultural evolution that we find these positive examples. I've made a career by now of looking at successful examples and showing how they map onto the core
The core
design
design
principles.
principles. Oh
Just
yeah.
recently, I've done it for the conscious capitalism movement, for the B Corp movement.
So have you published that database or that list?
Well, I've done podcasts, and then the more formal studies, I think, is what we're starting to do, including
Hmm.
this. Let me list one because it's so amazing, and then I can send people to the podcast. This
Okay.
one uh, manufacturing company called Barry Waymiller in the American Midwest, whose CEO, Bob Chapman, is, a good Christian is who he is. That's where he gets his values. And he and he and
Mm,
he and he implements these values so deeply that he's created a company that truly cares for its people as its first priority. So
mm,
that's great. That's like a feel-good business case. But what they've done is they have acquired. They don't use the word acquire. They use the word adopt. Uh, over 140 other companies and turn them around too.
oh,
And so when
great.
we approach that from a cultural evolutionary perspective, we can say this is a replicated natural experiment in cultural
Hmm.
evolution. That's how we have to think of it. That's how we have to document it with numbers now.
Yeah.
So that is now a proper analysis of what how they how they do this. That's what it means to approach this from a rigorous scientific cultural
What's the name
perspective.
of the company again?
Barry Wehmiller, Wehmiller, and they have a book with regards to Sodia. This is a
Oh.
poster example of the conscious capitalism movement, and they've written a book together called Everybody Matters.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
so it's written about in a trade book, and so by all means. But if you want to get the evolutionary connection, then we'll put the podcast in my
Okay.
loner notes, and then you can do the same thing for um, the B Corp movement, which is
Yeah.
amazing
Yeah.
work by a book by Chris Marquis. I mean, a part of this, I think, um, is we say all groups need two common denominators to be well governed in the present and to be adaptable uh, to change in the future. So
Mm.
governance and adaptability
Hmm.
are the two common denominators for all groups. And adaptability is nothing more than experimentation, basically a rapid cycling of variation, selection, and replication. That's what it means to experiment is you have a goal. It should be a systemic goal. It should be a aspirational goal. You try stuff out to reach the goal,
Yeah.
and you retain what works.
And
And you do it again and again and again. You don't have to
that's
have formal training in evolution to do that, but so do you
and that's the
recognize?
idea of adaptive management. I think that's been around for a
Absolutely.
while as well. I mean, that's the yeah, that's the same idea.
So
And
so go
certainly
ahead.
the governance part I think is really important too. You know, like how do we make group decisions, you know, in a way that actually is aiming toward the group goal. And you know, can we do a better job with democracy? Because I think a lot of our current things that are called democracy are really not that in any depth. A very weak democracy at best. So how do we get to a strong, more deliberative democracy? I think is one thing that's been brought up that I talk about a little bit in the book.
Hmm.
But also, you know, how do we get beyond the sort of argument culture that a lot of these decision-making processes are embedded in? You know, where everything's black or white, you pick a side, you know, it's 50%, 51%, you know, majority rule. And so something more akin to sociocracy. I'm not sure if you run across that
I have
term.
indeed. I think
Yeah.
sociocracy. I know it well.
So something that's more, how do we build a strong consensus, or at least how do we get to decisions that everyone's at least okay with, if not totally on board, you know, and the process of getting there through, you know, discussing problems that people might have with a particular decision and trying to work things out. So I think that the combination of those two, a more deliberative approach to democracy that's not so, you know, where the representation is really of the population. You know, this whole idea of sortition that the Greeks used to use of just randomly
Yeah.
selecting the representatives,
Yeah.
having them deliberate, then you're getting a representative sample of the population to come to a decision. You know, and if you have the right decision-making process embedded in there, they can come to a decision that is probably the best that can be done under the circumstances. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done to evolve, you know, better governance in these complex systems. And and there have been experiments, you know, at smaller scales in eco villages and things like that, where how to employ those kinds of principles. But scaling
Yes.
them up again is the issue.
So, in the series of articles I've written with Dennis, and you were kind enough to read the part one of them, we make two critiques. One is the critique of neoclassical economics, but the other is the critique of what we call diffuse pluralism.
Mm,
And when we say that we need transdisciplinarity, I think, of course, we do, but there has to be some conceptual glue
mhm,
that ties them together. And if you don't have that glue, then you have a Tower of Babel, you have silos, you have, I use the archipelago metaphor, many islands of thought and practice with little communication among islands. And we say that whatever you might think about neoclassical economics, it is an integrated framework. It's a tightly interwoven set of ideas which relates things to each other, which leads to policy, not the right policy, but you can do math around it and so on. And I think that one of the
And
things I've, go ahead.
and it's pretty immune to change as well.
And it's immune to
Like,
change, like all paradigms are.
yeah.
The theory decides what you could observe, and so it definitely um, orients perception. All meaning systems do. All meaning systems um, um, do. And one of the things I've learned through reading and the history of social thought, including economics, and and having interviews like this one. Um, Most recently with Charles Kamik, who's a sociologist who wrote a biography of Thorstein Veblen.
Mhm.
And basically, it's the history of economics during the late 1800s and early 1900s in America, especially um, in America. And but what I've what I've learned is that back then and still today, there's an, an enormous appeal of scientific legitimacy that we want our field to be scientific. Just yesterday, in the New Paradigm Coalition, Chris Markey gave a talk and about how the management profession really needs legitimacy. It needs to be scientific. And how's it going to be scientific? Well, that's where economics, where neoclassical economics comes in, because it gives the illusion, the
Of
appearance or
science.
the illusion of being scientific
Yeah.
compared to a hodgepodge of other perspectives. And I think it's true that if you go to other disciplines in the social sciences, sociology, anthropology, you do get a hodgepodge of other um,
Mm.
perspectives. There's no unifying theoretical framework to those disciplines. No, I mean the whole concept of theory is pluralistic. There's many theories, and they're proud of that fact. And so, go ahead.
No, no, I take your point, and I think that's really important. And I think what we need is what I've been calling intelligent pluralism. So it's not like all theories, all ideas are equally good, and that's kind of that extreme. But on the other hand, all models are wrong. So what you're really looking for, but some are useful. And so what you're really looking for are what are useful models, what are useful paradigms, what actually helps us to achieve our goals in the current state of the system. And so, and I think that can help you to weed out the approaches that might sound nice, but really are not all that helpful or all that useful in the real world, and recognize that none of the theories or even evolution, I think, it's at least limited in terms of scope, and all models are going to be limited to some extent and are wrong in that sense. So you can't apply them to all situations. Nothing wrong with that, but it has to be, I think, recognized and incorporated into the approach. And our challenge, I think, is to build better models going forward. Certainly, the evolutionary approach, I think, is one that is really useful because it does span across, all of those different scales. And yeah, and I think we can justify it mainly on those grounds, and we can justify some other approaches as well, if they happen to be useful in the context that they're applied to. But not to get stuck in the trap of saying, well, this is the answer. This is the
Yeah,
way the
so
world
I
is.
agree with about 80% of it. And so let's focus on the 20%.
See,
Um,
that's the other thing. The, I don't know if you've ever read Deborah Tannen's book, The Argument Culture.
yeah.
That that's what we tend to do as academics, and Well, you'll agree with 99% of what I said, but we'll focus on the 1% that you don't
No,
agree
no,
on
no.
because
I
that gives
mean,
us something to talk about. But
no,
anyway,
no.
yeah.
We'll focus on both the zone of agreement and the zone of disagreement.
Okay.
Um, and and I think you will probably agree with that the two foundational bodies of knowledge are one, complex system science, and the fact that the world is complex, and and that we really need to understand complexity, and that's new because it required the advent of widespread computing. So, I mean, before the advent of widespread computing, you might know that the world is complex, and you might describe that complexity in words, but in terms of actually rigorously studying complex systems, just, analytical mathematics by itself is just extremely, extremely
Limited.
limiting.
Yeah.
We have the distinction between the two-body problem and the three-body problem in physics. And my favorite example is the jointed pendulum, that if you have a pendulum with just one rigid arm, it goes like this, but put in one joint or two joints, and every time you swing it, it traces a different picture.
Mm,
So just going from one arm to two arms
yeah.
crosses some kind of threshold. And
Right.
so,
But
um,
that just means complex systems ideas have become now a much more useful model
mhm.
because we can do something with those ideas that we couldn't do before, even if we had them.
But it also becomes a general body of information. Just stick to my point. Um, so, so one point in our zone of agreement is that this forces you to model specific things. There's no like general fundamental theorem that's that's that you can derive um, corollaries. And the whole aspiration, I think, of neoclassical economics being rooted in uh,
Physics.
Newtonian physics, that we could have
Mm,
a physics of social behavior, I think is wrong-headed from the start. So when we do make models, we make them on limited phenomena. We expect them to be um, wrong. The map is not the territory. You have to have a huge family of models, like it's like modeling the weather. You just have to there has to be a frequent iteration between the modeling and the observations, and so these are all things in which I think that you were um, calling attention to, and I would agree with that. But there is something about evolutionary theory within the biological sciences which does not have major alternatives. So you have this statement that Dobzhansky made in 1970: "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." What does that mean? Why was it that from the very beginning Darwin's theory was thought to be to have such a wide explanatory scope? And why is it that really in the biological sciences, evolutionary theory is diverse? Of course, it includes many sub-theories and models, but there's something about it that does provide a kind of a glue
hmm
for studying all living processes. And so if we
Yeah,
could,
no, I don't disagree with
for,
that at all. But go
yeah,
ahead.
so I think, but if that kind of, if whatever that is could be extended
hmm
to all things human, I think that would be a form of integrated transdisciplinarity. So the model already exists in the biological sciences that could be extended to a topic like economics or any other human-related topic. That would be, of course, what we're reaching for. And I'm glad that you don't disagree with it. But
No, and
um,
the whole idea of cultural evolution, I think that's hugely important way of looking at things. Yeah. And understanding how these systems change. And certainly what, your work on multi-level selection and, the fact that there's selection at that level of groups, I think I think that's really important. And that's an important model to help us, understand the world and try to make a better one.
yeah, and so good. And so I'm really happy to hear that. Now, of course, if we want to be, well, where do I want to go with this next? First of all, I want to establish a timeline. Uh, Something I'm fond of saying is that the last 50 years is more than just 10% of the scientific revolution. That the last 50 years has seen the emergence of this foundational um, knowledge, both complex system science and evolutionary science. So, I mean, we date ecological economics, you said, to 1989.
That's
Evolutionary,
when we started the society, but yeah, it probably
well,
goes back further
evolutionary
than that, but yeah.
economics, another school of thought, was founded in the 1980s with
Yeah.
Nelson and Winters um, um, book. Um, that statement, nothing in biology makes sense, was in the 1970s. Cultural evolution really didn't get started until the 1980s, and now we have people like Richard, names familiar to you, Richardson, Boyd, and
Boyd,
Henry.
yeah. Yeah.
Most recently, Muthu Krishna. These are all names that are. Point being, all of this is so new, and so it shouldn't surprise us that it's only matured to the point that that it could be it could be applied. And so that's why I feel that what's taking place in today, 2024, is different than 20 or 30 years ago,
Mhm.
and in a position to provide that integrative framework that that goes beyond what we call diffuse pluralism. So now what we have is a worthy alternative to neoclassical economics as far as being an integrative framework is is concerned. That's what I feel is new and what's capable of basically making more rapid progress than in the past. So is
Mhm.
to apply this evolution slash complexity integrated framework and to think of it as an integrated framework so that when we think about change, we said we're trying to consciously evolve our futures. It's a multi-level
Yeah.
process. If we want society to
And
look,
I don't think that's much different from what ecological economics has been trying to do either.
yeah, yeah. So
Except maybe to say that, okay, we're open to other, you know, other perspectives as well, to the extent that they help achieve the goal. You know, so it's not, like I said, it's intelligent pluralism, not just sort of everything goes. But they do have to be integrated into some overall framework and picture of the world.
yeah,
And
what would be
so
another
yeah, so it's
perspective?
not
What would be a perspective that you would regard as different and not fitting into?
not very useful.
No, no, useful,
Oh,
useful. You're saying that
oh,
you're
different.
being intelligently pluralistic, and so I'm just trying to get an example of something that is
Well,
um,
the psychology perspective, I guess, is one that, you know, that's that's coming out of a whole different field of study. But I think it's important and useful to understand, you know, human behavior and understand how humans' behavior can change at the individual scale. So I think that's certainly something that needs to be integrated.
well, that's not beyond the purview of evolution.
No, but it's certainly not coming from an evolutionary, you know, perspective. I mean, I'm not sure that psychologists, you know, sit down and say, okay, what's the evolutionary, you know, theory behind what I'm observing here? I don't think they think that way. They're observing short-term behavior, you
Yeah.
know, and which is important to know about, but you know, doesn't require that they have a evolutionary model to understand that.
Well, another,
And the whole point of systems thinking is that systems behave differently at different scales, you know. So and they might have that evolutionary principle going on, but the time scales are different, the components are different, the you know the way that the system behaves is different. It's not just a matter of adding up the behavior of the, you know, the smaller scale units. So that's a key, you know, finding of the whole idea of systems. It's not reductionist. It's you have to look at multiple scales and understand how they interact with each other as a separate thing.
yeah.
And so yeah,
So
Anyway,
no disagreement there at any point. And so, and of course, we do have fields that historically have not um, been from an evolutionary perspective, and of course, they've come up with many, many valuable insights.
yeah.
I'll give you an example. Um, Dual inheritance theory, basically, from an evolutionary perspective, um, conceptualizes symbolic systems, human meaning systems, worldviews, meaning systems, as the cultural equivalent of our genes. So
Mm,
there are two streams of inheritance in our species, a symbolic stream and a genetic stream. And so this perspective is new. The whole history of thinking about human symbolic thought has been not from that
yeah,
perspective.
yeah.
And it exists of many, many separate disciplines that are don't communicate with each other. If you looked at all the different uh, schools of thought about symbolic thought, it would surely be an archipelago.
Mm,
And so the question then is there any kind of synthesis that could take place so that we could actually look at all of these different approaches to human symbolic thought and see them in a more integrated way as
mm,
the cultural equivalent of our genes? What would the added value be? I think whenever you approach something like that is with respect, so that so it's not um, as I mean definitely a two-way street
mm.
in terms of the transfer of knowledge. Well,
So you're talking about E.O. Wilson's idea of consilience as well, right?
consilience as well. E.O. Wilson's expression of consilience.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. So, do you have thoughts about that?
I think it's a great idea. Yeah.
Yeah. So, uh, so I think that kind of consilience, the more it advances, then the more I think and I can see that as nonlinear. Again, in honor of
Mm,
complex systems, there's no reason that because it's been slow in the past, it has to remain um, it has to remain slow. I think the concept of catalysis is something
yeah.
that's really interesting to understand what it means in chemistry and what it could mean in culture. So these are
Mm,
all things that make me excited about rapid change, basically the possibility of rapid change.
hmm. Yeah. Do you think we will see that rapid cultural change? Which
Well, I think we
certainly,
have
certainly
to.
we need it at the moment.
I think we need to appreciate. We need to see it as a possibility
Mm,
and not try to put a probability on it. But if you see it as a possibility, a genuine possibility, then you could work towards it, and you would want to work towards it, even if the probability
yeah.
is low.
No, I understand. And that gets back to the whole sort of addiction therapy as well. You've got to have, a clear goal set up and the hope that you can get there, because if you don't, you're never going to get anywhere.
Yeah,
But you're going to be right where you were. So it's yeah, and this idea of hope and balancing hope and fear, I think, is what is probably needed to drive the system into a new state,
yeah.
into a better
You
state.
know, Bob, I have a quibble that it's actually a fairly important quibble um, about the addiction analog, not
Mm,
metaphor, but analog, which is great. But I feel that uh, an addiction is a trap, but there's traps that are not addictions. And so when we talk about cultures being trapped, if you think of a physical trap, if I'm in a physical trap and I want to get out, that's not an addiction. It's something else, but it's not an addiction. And so I love the addiction concept. And of course, working with Paul and others, I see exactly the point that you're making. But I do also think that there are certain kinds of traps, ways that individuals and societies can be stuck, which don't qualify as addictions. And so addiction is not quite as general as we might want it to be. And do you have thoughts on that?
well, I started thinking along these lines with work on social traps, it was called at the time. I guess back in the late 70s and 80s. And so there were psychologists working along these lines.
Right.
And talking about investment traps. And I think that's, I don't know if you want to call that an addiction or not, but maybe traps is the more general term than addictions. But yeah, I can go along with that. I mean, there's one really interesting social trap that I've played around with, something called the dollar auction game. I'm not sure if you've
Yeah.
ever run
You
across that
describe
one.
it. Well, you describe it in your book.
Which is just incredible. And I think it explains a lot of the kinds of behavior that you see. It's sunk costs, phenomena.
Yeah.
It can be thought of as an addiction, or the addiction to the current economic paradigm. I think they all fit into that category. But that particular little game just makes it so obvious,
Well, describe it
that
to our listeners. Describe it to our listeners because it
so
is
that
diabolical.
yeah, you can try this at home. But so you auction off a dollar or some other unit of currency uh, for and the only distinction is both the highest bidder and the second highest bidder have to pay their bid, and only the highest bidder gets the prize. So if you say you start with $1 and you're auctioning off $1, and somebody bids 5 cents, somebody bids 10 cents, this is great. I'm going to bid 10 cents on a dollar. Once they get to 50 cents, they're paying the auctioneer more than the dollar. And when they get close to a dollar, so if somebody had bid, 95 cents, and somebody's trying to decide, do I go up to a dollar? Yeah. Yeah. Well, the 95-cent person is going to lose their bid if they lose. So do they go beyond the dollar? Well, if I go up to $1.05, I'm only going to lose 5 cents if I win the dollar bid. And if I drop out now, I'm going to lose 95 cents. So it's rational, and that's the trap. It's rational for every short-term decision to raise. But in the end, people end up, bidding literally hundreds of dollars for a $1 prize, which is totally irrational. And you sort of see that in everyday situations, arms races and things like that are essentially investment traps.
Yeah. So
So,
actually, this probably will be the last segment of our conversation, but it takes us back to ecosystem ecology. Let me spend a few minutes setting it up. And here, this is my home turf because I'm trained as a biologist, as you are. Um, but if you go back to the early days of ecology, it was kind of divided into two branches. One which sort of more or less studied species as the unit, and the other ecosystems as a unit. And Odum, of course,
mhm,
the two Odums were pioneers, including people like Raymond Margolef and so on, who were familiar to you. But there was a lot of confusion at that time as to whether an ecosystem, how, whether it functioned like a single organism. Could you say, for example, that as ecosystems evolve, that they become efficient at recycling their nutrients, and that you can treat nutrient cycling as like the blood flow of an organism, and and so on. And gradually it emerged that uh, uh, actually, in most cases, ecosystems are not like that. Ecosystems are collections of species, and each species is pursuing its adaptive strategy. So the species or the individuals within the species were pursuing their adaptive strategies. So they were functionally organized. An individual organism, of course, is exquisitely functional organized, but their interactions do not automatically add up to a, a unit that's efficient as a unit. And I like to talk about beaver ecosystems this way
mhm,
because if you want to understand a beaver ecosystem, ask the question, what's in it for the beaver? The
mhm,
beaver is modifying its habitat to protect itself from predators. It's eating the most palatable plants. What's left over are the best protected plants, and they're releasing their toxins into the water. And so and so the idea basically it turns nature into a kind of a laissez-faire economy. And for the same reasons, we don't expect laissez-faire economies to function well, or at least we shouldn't. That's
mhm,
the metaphor. That's basically the great fallacy of the invisible hand metaphor. It's just it is not the case that the lower level pursuit of self-interest robustly benefits the common good. Not true. It's
mhm,
not true in human life, and it's not true in nature.
Mm,
And so in nature, what we find, the common um, a phrase that's often used is it's a very complex system. The system is frequently out of equilibrium, or there can be many basins of attractions that are locally stable. But that's what defines them is their local stability. That doesn't mean that they function well
mm,
necessarily as collectives. No. In order to function well as a collective, you need to have a process of selection at that level. That's true in nature no less than in human life. And so I think that the real message, which I think is of the appropriate generality, which includes addictions and more, is that whenever we have a system composed of agents pursuing their own local adaptive strategies, then that system is unlikely to be working well as a system. You must treat that system as the unit of of uh, of selection. And to take you, for example, the case of Mayan civilization, which is
mm.
is uh, part of your book. So it existed for a period of time and then it collapsed.
Yeah.
I think in this and other cases, nobody, I mean, hardly anybody looked up and said, "Oh my gosh, our civilization is in trouble." No way. They were trying to grow their corn or manage their herds or conquer the next people or all lower level decisions, which,
Well, they did have a governance system
yeah,
and cities, and those elites, I think, were concerned about how the overall system was functioning. And I think ecosystems have structure for sure. And that structure is, an adaptation to their physical conditions. Rainfall
at their
soils
scale, yeah.
at the site, and so, you think of things like coral reefs that can flip, from that structure, which is pretty distinctive, to, an algae based structure that's
Yeah,
also very distinctive, but much less desirable from our perspective,
from a
and
human
probably
perspective.
from a human perspective, but perhaps from the perspective of, system productivity as well.
Yeah,
But
well, the whole
nevertheless,
concept of ecosystem services,
yeah.
of course, that's such a human-oriented trait that, of course, we have to select for those. We're not going to automatically, biological systems are not going to automatically provide the services we want. I mean, they will to an extent, I guess, but I mean,
Well,
let's talk.
we evolved in those systems, so there, we have been benefiting from those services,
Yeah,
for our whole evolutionary history, and
yeah,
adapting to the kinds of things that those systems provide. And we certainly kind of overpowered many of them with fossil fuels and industrial
of course.
production. But but still, ecosystems do have structure, and like you say, they're not in the sort of, nice balance that I think used to be the idea, that
And you
there's a
can't just, and
finite
you,
system.
yeah,
Yeah, and
exactly. You can't just
they're
leave them
constantly,
alone. The idea that if we just leave a natural system alone, it's going to reach some kind of
equilibrium.
balance.
Yeah.
Um, not true. I mean, that is that,
Well, I mean, there'll be certain characteristics that will probably occur given the external conditions of temperature and rainfall, etc. But change those conditions and things will change, or introduce new species from elsewhere, and those things will change. And understanding how those changes occur is that's what you need some complex modeling to
very, very
understand.
complex model. Yeah, tell me a
So
little bit about adaptive management, um, uh, because I think that's an important.
yeah,
Uh,
Carl Walters, have you run across him? Carl Walters from University of British Columbia.
okay.
Was one of, and Buzz Hulling, I guess,
Yep.
also was one of the originators of or proponents, at least, of that idea. And they were coming
Well,
from from a modeling perspective as well. That if you really want to understand a system, you got to think of the policies that you're implementing, not as the answer, the solution, but as an experiment that you're performing on the system, and that you should monitor the results and you should learn from the experiment and try to make the system better. And that's just adaptation, that's evolution, that's whatever you
so
want to.
it's
Yeah,
a managed
yeah,
process of cultural
yeah,
evolution.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
with the
I
positive
think
in
that
mind.
that idea has been around at least, as long as ecological economics, and from the 80s or
Yeah.
so. Uh, and yeah, I think these ideas keep coming around and getting, new terminology attached to them. And I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but at least it's showing that there's something to those ideas, that they keep coming around. Yeah.
Well, they can be generalized. They can be generalized. I did a whole series of conversations on this, the theme being two things don't work and only one thing can work. The two things that don't work are laissez-faire, because it's just not true that lower level interests benefit the common good automatically. The other thing that doesn't work is centralized planning, because the world is too complex to be understood by any group of experts. So what's left? Some process of
Adaptive management.
qualitative, adaptive management, and that since that's the only thing that can work, it's the only thing that ever has worked. And so that if you go and look at successful change efforts in any domain, then that's what you find. That's what worked.
Mhm.
But it was described in 1,000 different ways. And so the generality of it was left unreckoned. They didn't see the
Yeah, yeah,
simple generality. And that's I guess the point to end on, is that
yeah.
there's something very general at stake here. It's the need for evolution at the appropriate scale in order for systems. If we want systems that work well, we must select at the scale of the whole system, friends. And
Mm.
we must realize that what takes place within the system, unless we regulate it, unless it's well governed, will be disruptive, like cancer. And so,
And we have to have, the appropriate set of goals,
yep,
for what we're trying to achieve with the system. We're not just letting it go,
exactly,
at random.
exactly,
And
exactly.
so, and once you have that, I think we can make some progress.
Yep, and
So,
that's a great note to end on. Let's end on exactly that note.
okay, great.